My name's Monk Rowe. I'm extremely pleased to have Tom Scott with me here. It's morning in your time zone, and I'm in the afternoon. And thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Monk.
The first question I have is rather an easy one. I've been reading through the list of your accomplishments in all the fields, and I'm wondering, is there possibly more than one Tom Scott?
Well, not that I know. Actually, seriously, there is still, I believe he's still alive, a trumpet player, a session trumpet player in L.A. named Tom Scott. He was Thomas H. I'm Thomas W.
Hmm.
So when I first started doing sessions in the late '60s, early '70s, there was some mix-up at the union over whose check was whose. So there was a bit of that, but I haven't seen him in decades. I hope he's well. I don't know.
You probably eventually made more on your checks than him.
Well,
That's a guess of mine.
okay.
Okay,
I won't dispute that. Probably, I
all
guess.
right. Um, when you were young, let's say early teens, did you have this feeling like music is definitely my path? Had a musical household. I'm wondering then when you got a little older, did you have like a fall back on?
Oh, that's so funny. You should say that. That's that because I tried that. I actually let me back up a little bit. When I went to my reunion, my high school reunion, I think it was my 10th reunion. People came up to me and said, "You're the one who always knew what you wanted to do." And I hadn't really thought much about it, but it is true that music. I was just music. I I never really considered anything else. Honestly, I didn't know. Obviously, when you're in junior high and high school, you don't know how well you could do professionally. But my dad was a professional musician. I certainly had access to some quality music, both his record collection and my own father's music. He was a marvelous composer.
Is it
Um,
is it true that he wrote diddy da da diddy da 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 da?
no. Twilight
Okay.
Zone. No, he did do the underscore for several iconic episodes of Twilight Zone. I think, the most famous one is uh, "A Stop at Willoughby." It was called, where a guy takes a train and he goes back to his hometown, and he's an advertising executive or something. He's very unhappy with his life, and he gets back to this town and realizes, wait a minute, this is the way it looked when I was a kid.
Hmm.
um, and so on. So yes, my father was a wonderful composer. In fact, just a little aside, he when he passed, in the middle part of the first decade of the 2000s, 2006 or seven, uh, I was doing a session. A big orchestral session in which there was a portion in which John Williams was going to come and do a medley of famous Academy Award themes, and he came into the room. Now I knew him. I had met him a couple of times, a few times, here and there. But he came right up to. I was at the end of the woodwind section. He walked into the room, saw me, and came right up to me and kneeled down and said, "Tom, I just wanted you to know that when I was just a studio piano player in the '50s, and considering whether I wanted to take the leap into film composing and television composing or not. He said one of my first assignments was under your father, and he said one of the reasons that I decided to continue pursuing a career in television and film music scoring was the fact that your father was so kind and encouraging to me." And he says, "I never forgot that." And I thought, what nicer thing can one say about somebody's father, you know? And also, I think if my dad had been a jerk, would we have Star Wars, Superman, Jaws, Indiana Jones, all these great themes? But
Wow,
anyway,
that's some
but back
thought.
but back to your question. So there was music all around me, and I knew it's what I wanted to do from a very early age, I guess. Now, I had to do. I went into the Air National Guard band based in Van Nuys. Actually, I did. a year in street clothes because the Vietnam War was in its, it's raging, and there wasn't enough. They didn't even have uniforms, or they couldn't send me to basic training. But I enlisted. It was a year before I even did basic training, so I did a year in like street clothes, rehearsing with this band 2 times a month. We went one weekend a month, Saturday and Sunday, and this went on for 6 years. But it kept me from having to worry about being drafted, which, of course, this is before the lottery system. You were,
I
if you,
experienced that.
yeah, okay, so so if you either weren't, in a full, having a full college load, or um, could convince them that you were nuts, or gay, or something that would, or had a serious physical disability, you were drafted, and of course you had the option of enlisting. So that's what I ended up doing. I enlisted in this band. They actually recruited me, to be honest with you. Um, so I did my basic training and came back. And at that point, of course, I had the freedom to decide what I wanted to do. I went to USC for intending to be a music major, but I was so discouraged by the fact that there was no outlet for me to put together. I asked the professor when I signed up, what are the chances of me putting together some kind of an ensemble? I was already doing that. Okay, I already had a little band that I was writing for, kind of a Gil Evansy sort of an instrumentation, an 8 or 9 piece, I forget what it was, band. So I proposed this to this guy. Can I continue that kind of activity in a in an unused room at the school? And the guy looked at me. I swear to you, he said, "Well, maybe when you're a senior or a graduate student." Now, I didn't take very kindly to that. I was not thrilled about that answer. So I did a half a year just doing general ed courses. I think philosophy and logic, a couple of things, and and then summer came because it was in the middle semester, and I thought, you know what? Maybe I'll go to UCLA. Never mind USC. I'll go to UCLA and enroll. Maybe it's like philosophy or psychology or something to fall back on. And you know what happened? I went there to enroll, to register the classes, to this giant campus where I'd be walking around, uh, endless, I don't know, miles. It looked like miles to me, and to take these courses. And I just thought, you know what, this is not what I want to do. And of course, I was starting to work, so I had a little conference with my parents, and also I remember sitting at Dante's Jazz Club with Chuck Berghofer, a great bass player, and ask him, Chuck, what do you think I should do? Chuck says, hey, if you want to do music, you should do it. And I never looked back.
Were there some aha moments? We might call them epiphanies now. But you mentioned something we spoke briefly on the phone, and you talked this about a circumstance with Jerry Mulligan and Bob Brookmeyer.
Oh yeah,
Can you revisit that for me because I found it really interesting?
absolutely. Well, see, I had met. Well, let me back up a little bit. I did 2 albums for Bob Thiel, Impulse Records. Actually, Oliver Nelson, God bless him, he provided the opportunity for Bob Thiel, the founder or at least, yeah, I think it was the founder of Impulse Records, which of course was the label for it. All of John Coltrane's, you know, work until he passed. Um, Eric Dolphy, Oliver Nelson, Charlie Mingus, a whole, just like the jazz cream of the crop, right? So this was such a privilege to be on this label. And Bob called me and said, listen, I've arranged for you to solo with the bye. Uh, Arranged for you to to solo on. Maybe I ought to go into another room. Anyway, no. Arranged for me to solo with the North Texas State Lab Band under the direction of a guy named Leon Breeden, who was a great guy. You may remember that name. He was fabulous. I loved him. So I flew a plane to Montreux, Switzerland, where they were part of the Montreux Jazz Festival in 1970, and I played with the lab band. Jerry Mulligan was there, and I swear this is like. In fact, I've got the picture here somewhere. Oh yeah, it's up there. Okay, if you can see that, it's a little hard to see. Let me see if I can.
Yeah, if you
There.
move your screen
That
just a bit.
that yeah that's me there, and that's Jerry Mulligan. He invited me to sit in with him at Montreux, and I was just like, oh my God, because he had been an idol of mine for. My first saxophone was the baritone sax.
Were you playing tenor on this particular circumstance, or?
Yes, I was. Yes,
Okay.
yes, it was a tenor, and so that was 70. So I believe the next year, I believe it was 71. I got a call from a record producer I knew, Stephen Goldman, who was also Roger Calloway's producer. Uh, would I be interested, or would I be interested? No, that's not what he said. He said, Jerry Mulligan wants you to play on his upcoming album, which ended up being called Age of Steam. I said, you got to be kidding me. Of course. I'd be thrilled and honored. So I go to the first rehearsal, which is at Joe Procaro's house. Joe Procaro, the drummer, who his sons all became great musicians, all of them. But we had this rehearsal, and there I am. There's Mulligan and Brookmeyer and me. And so we start to play, and you know how Mulligan and Brookmeyer had this great intuitive ability to play melody and counter melody, uh, almost like a Bach duet, where it's just beautiful what they did, and it was, of course, it was all improvised. They just were so expert at creating melodies and the harmonies that go with them. So here I am, this third guy, and Mulligan says, join in with us. So I'm listening over there to what's going on and thinking, okay, I'll try to fill in the missing note of a triad. And we go for a little while, and Brookmeyer says, stop. He says, Tom, listen, don't try to jump around and fill in notes. He says, pick an area, pick a register, and stay within that register, and we'll figure out the rest. Of course, I was like, yes, sir, Mr. Brookmeyer. Yes, my jazz idol. I'll do whatever the hell you say. So that's what I did, and of course, it worked out well.
That's so interesting because I've had that circumstance in giving lessons. Like, let's pick out whole notes and choose notes from the chord, and the student go ba da
Right.
da.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's what I did.
Well, you can't buy that kind of lesson.
You sure can't, boy. And of course, I've always had this thrill coming up of always, thank you, Lord, being placed in situations with players who were more advanced than me. So, I mean, frankly, like that kicks your ass, when when you have to step your game up to just be in the same room with these great musicians. That did marvelous things for my career, and that particular experience was no exception.
Did you remember feeling particularly nervous when the tape was rolling? And do you play different when you know you're being recorded?
No, I'm not thinking about that at all. I'm thinking about the music, and what the thing that I'm playing to, if it's a track, uh, what what the music dictates for me to play. I try to. I've always said, if I'm doing a solo for somebody or even my own records, I try to add the thing that will make that total music experience the best it can possibly be. And you could record it or not. that's I don't care. I don't care. And I've always felt that way. It doesn't matter.
From your quote resume, it looks like you weren't just happy with being a saxophone player. I mean by that you have film credits and conducting and arranging. Did that all develop about this in the same time?
Well, roughly. I mean, here's what happened. The first, if I remember this correctly, the first job that I was offered to write an episode of a television show was Universal. The music supervisor at Universal was a guy named Stanley Wilson, a friend of my father's. They had worked together at Republic Pictures years ago, but I was sort of, getting a reputation as this guy, this musical guy, and I'd written a couple of song tunes for Emil Richards, a couple of odd time tunes, and other things. I don't remember how exactly how Stanley Wilson came to believe that I would be, that I would work as a TV composer, but he believed it for whatever reason and hired me to do an episode of a thing series. It was called The Bold Ones, and it was actually three separate series that kind of rotated every week. There was a doctor and a lawyer and a cop, something like that. And I did one of them. I don't even remember which one it was now. But that was the beginning. So, once you do a movie or one show, that's a credit. And so now you have a credit. And so that gives you some more, I don't want to say clout, but it's certainly more credibility as a film and television composer. And then, of course, I befriended Dave Grusin. I played with him at Dante's. He played piano with the Howard Roberts quintet. It was me and Howard and Dave, John Guerin, and Chuck DeMonico, and it was a wonderful, wonderful band. And Dave was a great guy, and I guess he recognized my abilities as well. So there was a show for Quinn Martin Productions. Quinn Martin Productions back in those days dominated primetime television shows. They were
The
all like
Fugitive,
sorry.
The
Oh
Fugitive,
yeah,
and other, yes.
yeah. Fugitive, Cannon, Streets of San Francisco, Barnaby Jones, and more. But this was a show in 1969, I believe, starring an then unknown actor named Burt Reynolds, and it was called Dan August. And Dave had written a great theme for this show, wonderful, wonderful theme. But he was doing feature films by that time, so he couldn't do the weekly underscore for the show. So he told that music supervisor, another wonderful guy named John Elizalde, music supervisor for Quinn Martin Productions, but also a damn good composer in his own right. But anyway, Dave said, "Why don't you get Tom?" And so I was hired to do an episode of Dan August, which I still remember the joy, the elation of standing on a podium with all the best musicians in Hollywood. I had Vince DeRosa on French horn. I think Ray Brown played bass. Bud Shank on woodwinds, and just and the best violin players in the business. Erno Neufeld, I think, was the great concert master at that time, and it was just, oh my gosh, I can't tell you how good it felt to just hear this music coming back at you. It was a delight. I'll never forget it. So
Well,
that's how it started.
I want to say that you can't see the paperwork around me, but I have a question, and you just answered it.
I did. There
Yes,
you go.
that feeling of when you write an arrangement, no matter what the ensemble, especially the days before finale and Sibelius, you're not positive exactly what it's going to sound like until people play it. And that feeling when it works is something else, and when it doesn't, that's something else too.
Well, that's true. I didn't have the luxury of it not working.
How
It
did
pretty
you
much
make
had to work.
how did you make sure as much as possible that it worked? Did you copy your own parts at that time and all that, like the detail of it to make sure it was right?
Well, no. But what I did do, of course, was in those days, as you well know, you had to write out your scores one part at a time. And I wrote transposed scores because as a reed player, I couldn't stand to look at an alto saxophone part in concert. It just didn't look right to me. So I would compose and transpose as I was orchestrating. And excuse me. There was always a copyist on the staff, so I never had to copy my own parts. But listen, but here my dad. This is where my dad turned it. It was such a a great help to me because he said, "Son, don't compose at the piano. Compose in your head, and then write it down, and then use the piano to check and see what's right and maybe correct a voicing or something that you listen, you do it enough times, you get good at checking your work and going, okay, and you know enough about the instruments of the orchestra and what sounds good, and to trust that it's going to sound right."
And you had to learn how to work with a click track in your ear while
Oh
you're
yeah.
conducting, and
Oh yeah.
this segment is 18 seconds, etc.
That's correct. It was yeah, it was a whole separate science of how to make uh, some hit, some chord or something in the music hit at exactly the right time where the gun is fired or the car takes off or there's some bit of so there was a whole lot of mathematics involved. Once you decide what the right tempo is, what feels right, you can then determine what that is in terms of a metronome beat, which of course you have to translate to frames per second. A 12 frame click. Well, film runs at 24 frames per second. So a 24 frame click meant it one click every second. A 12 frame click, half of that would be a click every half a second, and then everything in between. So there was this book, the Carole King book, and this guy should have gotten an award for patience because to mathematically calculate what every page was a different click number, and it was 12-1. In other words, 12 and one sprocket hole, 12-2, 12 frame and two sprocket holes, based on the film, of course. So he calculated every beat from 0 to, well, as long as many calculations as a full page, a computer page turned sideways would accommodate all the way to the last thing, which would sometimes could go well into 8, 9, 10 minutes. So, you got to look at this book. Where does the thing I want to hit fall? Okay, that's click number 37. All right, well, then you got to manipulate your music in order to accommodate that hit. And that's the kind of thing. That was it. I mean, sometimes it took as long. Those chase scenes, especially every one of these cop shows that I did, always ended with a chase. Usually a car chase or a foot chase. Usually a car chase that would go, 2 or sometimes 3 minutes. So, when, oh God, I've got to do the chase today. So you'd walk into your music studio. Okay, what is this? To look at it or just try to remember. We couldn't really look at the video. We'd already seen it once at the studio. All we had was a cue sheet of all the significant and dialogue in a specific scene. So I'd go down and recall, visually, and it's everything's indicated. All significant action and dialogue is enumerated in this cue sheet. And then, okay, this happens there, and do all this math. I mean, that took, half a day sometimes to just block out a big chase cue. Then now you got to go back to bar one and start writing the actual music.
Regarding themes for the subsequent shows you did after Dan August, music sometimes can convey emotions, and sometimes music is just music. So, was your task to read the description of what this show is going to be about? Maybe about the characters. It's a cop, but he's got marital trouble. He's got a young kid, etc. And how much did the music you were trying to write reflect the story?
Right. A great question. Well, obviously, needless to say, music for films and television is a highly subjective matter. And so the good news for me, for me as a composer, is I get to see the film for the first time when it's basically complete, except for the music. I cannot tell you how many times I've said I don't want to read your script, I don't want to see it halfway edited, because I want to see as close as you can get to the final product as possible before you show it to me. Now that's not always possible. Sometimes I had to, see an incompleted a movie, or a movie that was still to be final edited. And of course, I was just reminded of one. I don't know what it was years ago. Some movie or to movie of the week or for television. So I'm busy writing, and the director calls and he says, "Listen, Tom, we've made some cuts in this one scene, but it won't affect you. Like hell, it won't affect me." I didn't say that back, but that's what I'm thinking. Let me be the judge of whether it affects me or not, because it could change everything. It could change the whole tone of it. But back to your question, I like to respond, as I say, when I'm seeing the final or closest to final version. I want to respond as the audience does. I'm the first audience, so the music should should work kind of in terms of the audience's expectations. In other words, um, is it just literally like a chase, somebody chasing somebody, or is there some psychological? I love, by the way, scenes where there's some psychological drama, not just what's going on action wise in the screen, but what's going on in someone's head. They're about to murder somebody, but they're not sure whether they want to do it or not. But they're having this normal conversation with the person who may be this victim, and you got to play. They're thinking, "Oh, I want to get this person," but you have to do it. That's really fun. Um, the action scenes. I mean, they've got to be done. But uh, I the you asked about whether knowing the character's full story um, doesn't necessarily matter. It only matters in terms of what this scene is that we're looking at, and what's going on there, and do these character elements, do they play into this scene or not? And if they do, then obviously you gotta take that into consideration.
There's probably musicians union scale and other organizations, but the more you do, the more films you do, can you start to demand or ask for uh, better compensation?
Well, sure. I mean, of course, those of us who have done this work, we all have agents whose job it is to negotiate such things. Um, in television, at the time I was doing the episodic stuff, the '70s mostly, '70s and '80s, there was more or less a set fee for composing an episode of a hour dramatic series, and so there wasn't a whole lot of negotiation going on. But as is the case with all negotiations, your power is what you bring to the table, what strength you bring to the negotiating table. If you're young and don't have any credits, then you can't expect to demand very much. But obviously, the more credits you accrue, and particularly if you're associated with something that's a hit, that in a movie, for example, that could give you more clout, definitely.
Did you, in the early days of your writing, actually go to see the movie, go to the theater and see the movie that you just scored? Or you had it by then?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if I did. I'm sure I did. I just don't recall offhand because, of course, when you look at a movie or score it from the cue sheets, you kind of know it inside out. So it's always good to know whether your music works with the movie, and of course you find that out on the scoring stage with an orchestra and a playback. Um, and occasionally a producer or director will go, "Listen, this part is bothering me. Can we, fix it?" So I say, "Yes, give me 10 minutes," and then I go in the orchestra and start dictating changes on the
Dictating
fly.
dictating changes to whom?
to whatever musicians need to either stop doing what they're doing or do more.
Okay. So now we're talking about, we just transitioned, I think, nicely to those studio cats, which
Yeah.
you of course, it's been a big part of your life, and your rise from, let's say, second alto to soloist, I guess, was because you did well at every stage.
I guess. you know, I mean, life is a continuum, and so it's yes, that must have been it.
Okay. So let's say we're going to pick 19. You had mentioned 1973. That was a heck of a lot of things you did that year. And in that time period, can you talk me through a typical day in the life of Tom Scott as far as perhaps getting a call to play a solo on someone's record?
hmm
Can you tell me how that happens and then what it was like in the studio?
You bet. Sure. Um, First of all, your job, if you're playing a solo on someone else's record, obviously, your job is to provide a service. You're a gun for hire, so to speak, and your job is to make them happy with whatever you do. So I look to the artist and or the producer to give me any input that they want to. Sometimes it's in musical terms. Many times it isn't. They wanted to feel some more emotion here, or in the case of Joni Mitchell, she was a painter, and it is still is a painter. So she would say, I don't know, I want it more green over here. Now, what the hell does that mean? Well, it's my job to, translate into music, because Joni and many of the people I worked with were were not formally educated in music. They didn't know how. Joni didn't even know, with all those beautiful chords that she used to make up on the piano and the guitar, she couldn't name one of them. She didn't care what they were called. She just liked the sound of them. And so it was my job to figure out what it is that I can add to this thing to make it better than when than when I walked in. So, 73, I think I had, in the very beginning of the year, I did a tune with Carole King called Jazzman. And I had not yet met Carole King. I think I met Lou Adler, uh, because I used to work, as many of us studio musicians did, at the A&M Recording Complex, which formerly was the Charlie Chaplin studio many years ago in the silent era, and currently is I think it's called the Jim Henson studio now. But there was a complex in the back of one, two, three, four recording rooms, and I used to be called to go in there all the time. And you could walk in there. It seemed like the center of the pop music universe back then, because there'd be like Billy Preston over here, and the Carpenters over here, and Captain and Tennille, and John Lennon and Phil Spector in another room. Hey, Phil Spector was what a piece of work. But anyway, it was just a constant, wonderful music factory. It was fantastic. So I think I met Lou Adler on one of my previous trips into A&M. So uh, I get a call. Yes, Carole King would like you to play on her record. Okay, great. What instruments do I need? I need a tenor saxophone. Okay, great. Because at the time, I regularly was expected to have at my fingertips, uh, my woodwind battery consisted of piccolo, flute, alto flute, bass flute, clarinet, bass clarinet, soprano, actually sopranino, soprano, alto, tenor, and baritone, and then recorders. I had a soprano recorder, a tenor recorder, yeah, those two. So there was a lot of horns there to deal with. It was, for any of us woodwind players. It was a good idea to have a big trunk on the behind your car, because you needed the storage space. Anyway, So I go in with Carole King, and they're very sweet. They play me the tune, and Lou Adler says, "Look, just play what you feel." Okay, and that happens often. Play what you feel.
Did you even ask, like, well, what key's it in? Or you just wait to put the headphones on and you have your.
Yeah, I found out pretty quickly
Yeah.
what key it was in. Yeah, I didn't. You know. Fortunately, that one was in C. That one, so the people's key.
Yes.
Of course, D for the tenor saxophone. So
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes you get those things like they're they're in the key of B and you're thinking, "Oh, my licks, I don't know if I can play those in C sharp."
well, they're certainly not as easy to do. You just reminded me. Recently, I did a session for Robbie Krieger of the Doors. He's still around. He's got a beautiful recording studio in Glendale, and I was called there. He wanted me to play on something, and in the middle of this tune, it was sort of like a tribute to Bill. I don't know what the thing was, but anyway, it was a jazz-based lyric, although it was a rock and roll tune for sure. But he said something about it. Well, it's they play, remember Bird or something like that, and then there's this section, and I have an alto saxophone, and I'm supposed to play it. It's of course he's a guitar player. What key do you think it's in? E.
E.
And I got through it, but I told him, Robbie, listen, if you ever write any tribute to jazz again, don't do it in E. Don't do it in E ever. If you go through the jazz fake books, you won't find one tune in the key of E. I guarantee it.
I'd like to talk about that later if we get back to it, but
Sure.
continue your so you go in the booth and Lou is there. Is
Yes.
Carole King there?
Yes. They both were there. Let me just say at the outset, they have remained to this day dear friends. They are both wonderful people. I actually did a podcast with Lou recently. I wanted to do one with Carole King, but one of her daughters, who is her manager, I called her and she said, "Listen, Tom, I don't think the answer will be no. I can tell you now. She just doesn't want to dwell on the past anymore, or she's probably done a billion interviews, and there's a point at which you go enough already." So, and plus, she always lived a rather solitary life. She was in Idaho, in a very, very remote part of Idaho. I'm not even sure they had indoor plumbing. It was really, really, in the woods kind of lifestyle. And just what a great lady. Lights up a room every time. So anyway, I listen to the thing. They say, play what you feel. I go out and I start playing. And I did a couple of takes, but I don't know. We connected. I connected with this tune. And I did maybe two or three takes. They kept all of them, and there's a couple of spots where you can hear me playing like two different solos simultaneously, because I don't know, they like the sound of the two things I played.
That was
But
that was on purpose then, not like bleed over from.
no, 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 not at all, because they were all on separate
Yes.
tracks. There
Okay.
was no bleed at all. So that went well. That was a delightful session, and it was Carole King. She just come off the incredible success of Tapestry, that album she did for Lou. In fact, Lou was the one who said to her, Carole, you ought to consider not just doing demos for other people, but do your own record. And she was, I don't know, maybe he talked her into it, and the result is Tapestry.
Did you get paid a predetermined fee for that particular session?
Yes.
Phil Woods told a story about how when he did Just the Way You
Billy
Are,
Joel. Yeah.
yeah, he could have got a percentage of every record or something, every 45 as a soloist.
He could have.
He could have, and he didn't know. And so
Under what agreement is that? I've never heard of that
you've
ever.
never heard of that.
No.
Well, I'm going to have to consult Phil if I can.
Well, that's going to be tough.
Yes, it is. So, but isn't there a thing, and I don't know if there's musicians union, but as a soloist, don't you get something beyond what, let's say, the bass player gets?
Well, um, in those days, many of the A players were getting double scale. In other words, twice as much as was required by the contract between the musicians union and the recording companies. It was fairly common for the A players to get double scale, and there was a point at which I sometimes asked for and got triple scale. I don't think in '73 I had enough credits to demand that. I probably well, if you're the sole musician on a session, you are automatically entitled to double scale because you are designated the leader. The leader gets double scale. So I had yet to rack up a whole lot of recording credits. So I was just happy to be there. I knew that I'd be paid, fairly. And I probably made double scale for that.
Mhm. And it's a type of session that you would have gone home and I want to tell somebody about this. If there's a question there, it's did your constant studio work ever get to the point where it was like another day in the office?
Well, it was another day in the office in a literal sense, but what you're saying is, did it get sort of ho hum, mundane? Never, never. Because very simply, you got to show up with your A game every single time. You're only as good as your last job. That's really true. And so, and plus, I loved my job. I looked forward to being able to leave a session and going, and go, I gave the best I could to that particular musical challenge. That's what rewards me. Other than the money, of course, the money was great, but I would never consciously walk out of a session going, I just phoned it in. I did always try to do the best I could.
Were there sessions where you left after playing multiple solos and you didn't know what they were going to use? And you might not find out what they were going to use until you were in your car listening.
Everyone where I did multiple solos, I never knew what they were going to use. You've reminded me of a gentleman named Michael Masser. I can't remember whether he's still with us or not, but he was a songwriter and record producer who called me one time. I didn't know him, but he got my number and said, "Listen, I'm producing a new young lady. I think she's a fantastic singer. I think she's going to be a big star. Her name is Whitney Houston, and I've written a bunch of songs for her. And I'd like you to play on one of them." I said, "Fine." So I showed up to the studio. Michael was there. Whitney Houston was not. She had already laid down her vocal tracks, so she didn't have to be there. And so it was a tune. It sort of reminded me. It definitely had a sort of '50s doo-wop kind of a feel. I mean, it was a big production, but basically it was don, do do don, do don, da 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 da, that kind of a thing. So it's nice, pleasant. And so I played Phil's behind her, and Michael Masser, he kept wanting, oh well, just do one more, do one more. So I don't know how many takes I did. It might have been over 20. And finally I said, "Look, Michael, um, I don't I whatever I did, you've got it. Whatever the best thing is I could possibly do is you've got it there somewhere. I don't have any more to give to this thing. I'm done." And I just said, I have to go now. So of course the record came out. It was a huge hit, and I have some nice solos, things I'm very happy about. I think it enhanced the tune very well for what it was, tenor sax solo thing. About 3 months later, this is before the record came out, the phone rings, and I answer the phone. Hello, and a young lady says, "Is this Tom Scott?" I said, "Yes." "Well, you don't know me, but my name is Whitney Houston. You played on my record." And I had to think a minute and said, "Oh, yeah, yeah, right. Hi, yes. How are you?" And she said, "I just wanted you to know that I really, really loved the work you did on my record." And I said, "Well, thank you. How nice of you is to call. Thanks for taking the time to do that." That was about the end of the conversation. And, with all the things that happened to Whitney Houston since then, unfortunate thing, tragic things, obviously. Um, I've always, whenever I hear anything said about her kind of negative, I go, you know what? I got to tell you something. And look, I don't expect people to do what she did. That was way beyond the call of duty, as far as I'm concerned. But she took the time to get my phone number, pick up the phone, call me, and tell me that. That's a real kind gesture, I think. And so I've always defended her, saying, look, and I always tell that story. And how many people do that? For whatever happened to her later in life, she definitely was a kind-hearted person, in her heart.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. It helps me look at her differently also.
Exactly.
Was there competition, friendly or not, between the saxophone players, especially because if any wind instrument is going to get a gig playing solos, it's probably going to be a saxophone. So
Right.
you have Ernie Watts and Plas Johnson and people at that level. Did you run into these other players and sort of like, so what have you been doing lately? Who did you play with?
Not at all. It was
No
not like
kidding.
that at all. No, no, no. We were a fraternity of very lucky musicians who managed to get into this very heady department of the music business. So we were thrilled to be there. I considered them, fellow travelers, fellow musicians who I respected and admired. Also there were others at the time. In addition to Ernie and Plaz, there was David Sanborn, there was Michael Brecker, there was Grover Washington. Um, uh, that's those guys pretty much. I'm sure there are other people I'm not mentioning, but we were very prominently featured as saxophone soloists. And look, you can't take a gig away from somebody. I mean, producers and artists like who they like, and they're going to call them. And at the time, of course, unlike today, there was plenty of work for everybody to just to uh, survive and flourish. So it didn't feel like that competition. In fact, I was they were my buddies, especially David and Michael, and Grover became a dear friend. Just great guys, And look, we had so much in common: our love for the saxophone and music and jazz. So, what are you going to do? Pretend you don't like somebody like that, or you're in competition with them? It wasn't a competition that way.